having a conversation today about Ultimate and where we see the future of research and development in terms of creating training protocols and stuff. So I'm Ren. I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I work with a lot of the Ultimate teams in this country and around the world, going around doing clinics specifically about shifting movement patterns and to increase performance and reduce injury.
I'm Dave. I'm an occupational injury researcher out of Chicago, and one of the things that I got interested in was sports injuries, and as an Ultimate player I thought, why don't we do a study of injuries? And with Jamie Newer we put that together and came out with that paper a couple years ago, and I wanted to come out here to Seattle to meet with Ren, and because in the end of the paper we said, let's have some studies and let's have Ultimate specific training programs. And we just wrote that down because we figured that was the right thing to write. And now that I'm here visiting, I wanted to come and see what you do in person, and it's great to see in person what an Ultimate specific training program is like. So it's really good to be here and to visit your gym and see you work people out.
Thank you so much. And you know, there's a lot of challenges around creating that kind of programming, and we're going to talk about some of them today. But I was so happy to see your paper just because, you know, as someone who's a coach and who's trying to work with a specific population, sometimes the dearth of research it's problematic in trying to create protocols, and so one of the things that we were talking about is the idea that the sport is becoming more formalized, and there's a lot more activity on all levels, youth to professional, and there's like some interesting things that come along with that, I think.
Yeah, the sport's definitely maturing in a way that formality and professionalism matter, and not just professionalism in terms of there are now a handful of professional Ultimate players. The sport, from high school to college to pro to club, has all different levels of athletes.
In Seattle, you know, we've got elementary school players and middle schooler players, you know, and so we're even looking at young athletes and kids that are growing up in this system, and so there's this professionalism piece in that, there are some people that are actually being paid to be professionals, but then there's people like me and, you know, others that are looking to support them, and we have to have a professional aspect to our own work, and that's kind of difficult, you know, as we said, when there's not as much research out there.
Yeah, there's industry growing up around Ultimate, and it's small and minor, but there are in fact people out there working surrounding Ultimate and doing Ultimate related things, and to not have the kind of formal training and the formal science behind Ultimate, it kind of is a lag for our sport, and I think this is a place that the sport really needs to go next.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I mean, I was so excited to see your paper because just to have someone focusing on it and focusing specifically on it, it's the kind of thing where you see things like that in soccer all the time, or, you know, in any other major sport. There's studies conducted, you know, like there's a population that you work with, but you know, so much of just the strength and conditioning science as a whole, not even Ultimate science, but just strength and conditioning, almost all of the research that's conducted in that field is conducted on sedentary populations. It's not even conducted with athletes. Because it turns out that high-level athletes, it's hard to get them in a room, it's hard to get them under a procedure, and for them to spend their kind of precious training time doing something that's sort of for the good of everybody. And so that, I think that's one of the problems I have with just in my profession in general. It's just there's not great studies, period, much less for Ultimate. But I know one of the things that you're talking about is that in order to really see some good reductions in injuries and some good performance enhancement stuff, all natural of course, is that we really need to have some real studies conducted, and like we were talking a little bit about what that looks like, you know?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the history and the training and the studies of Ultimate players, we just kind of assume that they're like soccer players or like lacrosse players. They go on the track and they run reps and they do cutting drills. And yeah, that's been fine for as long as we've existed, but if we're going to try to get more formal, and as we know, USA Ultimate is very interested in interacting more with the Olympic Committee.
Yeah.
And that kind of formality, if we want to be seen as peers, to our peer sports, we want to have that kind of science behind what we are and who we are. We're ultimate players, and they have this level of physicality and this explosiveness and this speed and this ability to jump. And it's a co-ed sport where we have men and women both doing the same movements and the same activities. How do they compare to one another?
Yeah.
And this kind of formality is a thing that I just think is a next step in the step of the evolution of ultimate. And I think it's great that it's being talked about, but
right.
To study it is going to be something systematically that's really going to be needing to go forward, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that for sure.
Yeah, no, I think so too, and I think in the next 5 or 10 years, I feel like the spotlight has really come on to ultimate and the training of ultimate. More and more and more ultimate players are getting interested in, you know, the idea that there are things that they can do besides just play ultimate that will help them be better athletes and have less injury risk. And I mean, I've at least seen a lot more interest in my services even in the last couple of years. It seemed like as soon as I turned my attention to this sport, everyone was like, oh great, oh thank goodness someone's paying attention, you know? And that's great and it's flattering, but it also leaves me in a position where a lot of times I'm kind of like, yeah guys, I'm kind of making this up. And I'm coming up with things based on the limited amount of research that's out there, mostly done on different sports or sedentary populations, and just my experience of working with, you know, Seattle athletes, which is just, that's not a very broad base on which to develop protocol.
Yes, but Seattle is a broader base than most places
That's true. I mean,
develop protocol.
It's the elementary schools.
That's true.
You know.
It's true. Not many places do you have elementary level ultimate, and that is amazing to have. I think the thing that we all want to jump to in terms of any scientific or injury-related study is the intervention. What's the intervention? How are we going to who are we going to randomize? A randomized clinical trial. That's what we have to have.
Right.
Well, we don't even know what a preliminary injury prevention program might be, not just for one individual, but for a team. And could you implement a systematic program that runs for an entire season that follows best practices from other sports and recommendations from other sports that we believe would work? And if we can implement it for a team for a full year, okay, maybe we can randomize certain teams to have this kind of intervention. Of course, before all that, we need to have a surveillance system to even know what their baseline injury rates are like and who's being injured and what effects at all, if any, a intervention program would have. So, I mean,
right.
Even before that kind of intervention would be implemented, we need to know really and truly what are the rates of the injuries for these different groups.
And I think that's the part that I think a lot of ultimate players don't necessarily understand is that the research has to start back a few levels from where we might like for it to be. Like we want to know, I keep straining my hamstring, how can I fix that? And or you know, my team has this incidence of ACLs and injuries that is higher than we want it to be. You know, how can we fix that? And I feel like the real answer is that anything that we try and do is going to be a best guess at this point because we don't have the levels of research yet to kind of to take us back to root causes.
Well, in surveillance and public health surveillance, it's systematic, regular collection of very specific types of data to make sure that you're getting the same thing over and over again. And then you can use that over a long-term period to see, are rates going up, are rates going down, have things changed, how have they changed? So in our paper, we simply showed, yeah, you can have a surveillance system exist and you can collect these data and you can get this kind of analysis done. But we did it for a season, over 100 teams, and that's it. It's over. It's done. If there was the interest in sustaining such a surveillance system, then we could look at interventions and say, ah, yes, there are ways to reduce injuries because these teams have these characteristics.
Okay.
But just to say we have a surveillance system, you can't survey and then stop. You have to keep it going and keep it ongoing.
Got it. And it's important, especially, I mean, I think when you're looking at something like a college population where there's a lot of turnover, like that's where it's really important to have it going for multiple years because you're dealing with different athletes within the same kind of framework as opposed to following the same athletes over a period of time, which is another way to do that kind of research.
So the way we did it initially, we just looked at the team and looked at it as a group. Another way that we could have approached it, which would have been more detailed information, but a lot more difficult to do, was track every individual. And the level of data collection would have been almost impossible for the tiny little study team that we had. But there's another way to do it. If you want to track someone through 4 years of college ultimate, 5 years of college ultimate, it's doable.
Right, right.
You know, it's gonna take a heavy lift to get it done.
Yeah, no kidding. I think that, you know, my pipe dream is eventually to have at least one or two studies conducted on the type of metabolic conditioning that's best for ultimate, because I believe that the kind of output that's required from ultimate players over such a long period of time, of an entire weekend, even one game, is you know, you have to continue to be explosive. You have to continue to perform at this high level, and you have to do it for, you know, 2 days. And there's not another sport really that requires that of you. I mean, maybe you have a doubleheader, you know, but that's really different, right?
Yeah.
And so just this idea that that we have to condition people to be explosive. It's really difficult, and I think it's the trickiest part of the programming. And so I would love to have some kind of study where I was able to work with different groups and use different metabolic conditioning methods and see what got the best results. But again, I would need to have, the groups would need to be similar enough. You know, there would need to be, like, the training age would need to be similar. Like, we would have to have some controls in place, and again, just the data collection. How do you measure whether or not that's being effective? So I know that that's a couple studies. That's not this level, you know, that's this level. And so, you know.
Well, the study that I'm really thinking about right now is, in the ultimate, we always play injured. Like, there's no time going back to college ultimate where I was not injured in some way, shape, or form. And we played through, and then you stopped playing, and then you played again as soon as you were healthy enough. And I'm really, of late, been interested about the recovery trajectory, especially for a sport where we just don't want to stop ever, because God forbid we let our teammates down.
Well, and God forbid we lose our conditioning, and I think that that's what a lot of people are scared of, is that if I actually really stop, like, I'm not going to be able to get back going again. And, you know, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that something that interests me is we like to imagine that it's injury, treatment, recovery, then you return to that level that you were at before. And in this sport, if it's injury, treatment, some recovery, but you're playing, then you plateau, but you get hurt worse, and then you're forced to take a real long time off. What's that injury trajectory like? Is that a new injury? Have you re-injured that same thing?
Yeah.
And what sort of treatment do you have to get where you're worse off than when you started on your first injury?
Yeah.
And then when, if ever, do you make it back to that level, and your conditioning has suffered during this time as well?
Yeah.
So that's even a less data-intensive study, as more of like a anthropologic analysis.
Yeah,
of what's
no.
it like? What's the lived history of being an injured ultimate player, and how do you come back from that?
And I feel like, you know, that's the kind of data that I deal with in my job, because I'm working with those athletes and trying to help them figure out when it's appropriate to re-enter and when they should really keep sitting out, and you know, coming up with, you know, testing for hamstring injuries and stuff to say, are you safe to return to play, and things like that. And so I sort of do that, but it's in my little microcosm, and it's not necessarily something that, you know, it's definitely not formalized, you know, it's just kind of what I'm doing with my people. But I think ironically, people come back better from ACL injuries because they're forced to completely stop and to really focus on the movement patterns and correcting any asymmetries that they had before they start playing again. So I've seen a lot of people come back from ACL injuries and be at a higher performance level. And I think part of that is because they're forced to recover in a way that tweaking your hamstring or rolling your ankle doesn't really force you to.
Yeah, if you got an ACL injury, you're going to go through the formal medical system.
Yeah.
And in Ultimate, we've been for so long.
We're so informal.
The informal word of mouth, best practices, a lot of vitamin I, a lot of ice.
Oh God, so much vitamin I.
So much vitamin I. But when you have to enter the medical system, then you have to go through these formal steps that we not necessarily resist.
No,
but
I would say we resist them.
Okay, we resist them, it's true. But it's not necessarily that we're actively opposed to medical intervention, it's that we just don't do it. And if we're going to continue to be more professional and more formal in tournaments and international coverage and being on TV, even if it's the internet, you know, this internet TV, want to be internet famous.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of formal entry and integration with the medical system is something that we have to really consider about. If you're injured and you want to recover,
Yeah.
don't take vitamin I until you feel better. Stop.
Right.
And go
right.
through a full recovery program.
And I do feel like we have made some progress on those lines, because I see way more teams getting sponsored by PT clinics and chiropractic clinics, and having this association where they do have someone on the sideline, or if not on the sideline, they have someone that they can go to that's dedicated to working with them. And so I do see the interest there, and I think to some degree it still comes down to money and to the availability of resources. And one thing that I'm really interested in is there any way that we can better standardize that process so that people that don't have the same resources, teams that don't have the same resources, can still have access to the same resources. And that's something that we struggle with in Seattle. We have a very active South End kind of ultimate program we have a group called Age Up that has kind of been talking more lately and bringing more awareness to the fact that there's this whole group of ultimate players that don't have any support and can't travel to games and don't necessarily have the money from their families to get the proper food, support for tournaments and things. And are we really an inclusive sport, or are we a sport that as we move forward and become more formalized, we're becoming more exclusive? And I, for one, am really committed to maintaining and really pushing for just that kind of equality in how we treat athletes in this sport.
Yeah. Well, this really got deep all of a sudden.
I know, right? Sorry about that.
No. I think it's true though. We can't just do studies and interventions on professional ultimate players because they're the only ones with any sort of money. We have to make sure that in our ground up sport that we've always been, that we continue to look at every level of us, and be it the big colleges, the small colleges, the junior highs, everyone who's played ultimate, we have to try to make this systematic analysis of our sport at every level, and not just systematic analysis of pros.
I totally agree, and I would really love to work with you in the future on some kind of study or another. I'm sure we can figure something out.
It's a deal.
All right, sweet. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you for having me.
See you later.